Life of Mine Part 17. All my proposals for meeting the useless waste and drain upon our artistic capital by a more methodical arrangement met with the same success in every detail that I suggested. I had also found out by long experience that every proposal which had to be discussed and decided upon in the most tiring committee meetings, as for instance the starting of a repertoire, might at any moment be overthrown and altered for the worse by the temper of a singer or the plan of a junior business inspector. I was therefore driven to renounce my wasted efforts and, after many a stormy discussion and outspoken expression of my sentiments, I withdrew from taking any part whatever in any branch of the management and limited myself entirely to holding rehearsals and conducting performances of the operas provided for me. Although my relations with Eltisho grew more and more strained on this account, for the time being it mattered little whether my conduct pleased him or not, as otherwise my position was one which commanded respect, on account of the ever-increasing popularity of Tannhäuser and Rienzi, which were presented during the summer to houses packed with distinguished visitors, and were invariably chosen for the gala performances. By thus going my own way and refusing to be interfered with, I succeeded this summer, amid the delightful and perfect seclusion of my new home, in preserving myself in a frame of mind exceedingly favorable to the completion of my Lohengrin. My studies, which, as I have already mentioned, I pursued eagerly at the same time as I was working on my opera, made me feel more light-hearted than I had ever done before. For the first time I now mastered Aeschylus with real feeling and understanding. Droysen's eloquent commentaries in particular helped to bring before my imagination the intoxicating effect of the production of an Athenian tragedy, so that I could see the Orestia with my mind's eye, as though it were actually being performed, and its effect upon me was indescribable. Nothing, however, could equal the sublime emotion with which the Agamemnon trilogy inspired me, and to the last word of the Eumenides I lived in an atmosphere so far removed from the present day that I have never since been really able to reconcile myself with modern literature. My ideas about the whole significance of the drama and of the theater were, without a doubt, molded by these impressions. I worked my way through the other tragedians and finally reached Aristophanes. When I had spent the morning industriously upon the completion of the music for Lohengrin, I used to creep into the depths of a thick shrubbery in my part of the garden to get shelter from the summer heat, which was becoming more intense every day. My delight in the comedies of Aristophanes was boundless. When once his birds had plunged me into the full torrent of the genius of this wanton favorite of the Graces, as he used to call himself with conscious daring. Side by side with this poet I read the principal dialogues of Plato, and from the symposium I gained such a deep insight into the wonderful beauty of Greek life that I felt myself more truly at home in ancient Athens than in any conditions which the modern world has to offer. As I was following out a settled course of self-education, I did not wish to pursue my way further in the leading strings of any literary history, and I consequently turned my attention from the historical studies, which seemed to be my own peculiar province, and in which department Droysen's History of Alexander and the Hellenistic period, as well as Niebuhr and Gibbon, were of great help to me, and fell back once more upon my old and trusty guide, Jacob Grimm, for the study of German antiquity. In my efforts to master the myths of Germany more thoroughly than had been possible in my former perusal of the Nibelung and the Heldenbuch, Mona's particularly suggestive commentary on this Heldensage filled me with delight, although stricter scholars regarded this work with suspicion on account of the boldness of some of its statements. By this means I was drawn irresistibly to the northern sagas, and I now tried, as far as was possible without a fluent knowledge of the Scandinavian languages, to acquaint myself with the Edda, as well as with the prose version which existed of a considerable portion of the Heldensage. Read by the light of Mona's commentaries, the Volsungasaga had a decided influence upon my method of handling this material. My conceptions as to the inner significance of these old world legends, which had been growing for a long time, gradually gained strength and molded themselves with the plastic forms which inspired my later works. All this was sinking into my mind and slowly maturing, whilst with unfeigned delight I was finishing the music of the first 2 acts of Lohengrin, which were now at last completed. I now succeeded in shutting out the past and building up for myself a new world of the future, which presented itself with ever-growing clearness to my mind as the refuge whither I might retreat from all the miseries of modern opera and theater life. At the same time, my health and temper were settling down into a mood of almost unclouded serenity, which made me oblivious for a long time of all the worries of my position. I used to walk every day up into the neighboring hills, which rose from the banks of the Elbe to the Plauenscher Grand. I generally went alone, except for the company of our little dog Peps, and my excursions always resulted in producing a satisfactory number of ideas. At the same time, I found I had developed a capacity, which I had never possessed before, for good-tempered intercourse with the friends and acquaintances who liked to come from time to the Marcolini garden to share my simple supper. My visitors used often to find me perched on a high branch of a tree, or on the neck of the Neptune, which was the central figure of a large group of statuary in the middle of an old fountain, unfortunately always dry, belonging to the palmy days of the Marcolini estate. I used to enjoy walking with my friends up and down the broad footpath of the drive leading to the real palace, which had been laid especially for Napoleon in the fatal year 1813, when he had fixed his headquarters there. By August, the last month of summer, I had completely finished the composition of Lohengrin and felt that it was high time for me to have done so, as the needs of my position demanded imperatively that I should give my most serious attention to improving it, and it became a matter of supreme importance for me once more to take steps for having my operas produced in the German theaters. Even the success of Tannhäuser in Dresden, which became more obvious every day, did not attract the smallest notice anywhere else. Berlin was the only place which had any influence in the theatrical world of Germany, and I ought long before to have given my undivided attention to that city. From all I had heard of the special tastes of Friedrich Wilhelm IV, I felt perfectly justified in assuming that he would feel sympathetically inclined towards my later works and conceptions if I could only manage to bring them to his notice in the right light. On this hypothesis, I had already thought of dedicating Tannhäuser to him, and to gain permission to do so, I had to apply to Count Redern, the court musical director. From him I heard that the king could only accept the dedication of works which had actually been performed in his presence, and of which he thus had a personal knowledge. As my Tannhäuser had been refused by the managers of the court theatre because it was considered too epic in form, the count added that if I wished to remain firm in my resolve, there was only one way out of the difficulty, and that was to adapt my opera as far as possible to a military band, and try to bring it to the king's notice on parade. This drove me to determine upon another plan of attack on Berlin. After this experience, I saw that I must open my campaign there with the opera that had won the most decided triumph in Dresden. I therefore obtained an audience of the Queen of Saxony, the sister of the King of Prussia, and begged her to use her influence with her brother to obtain a performance in Berlin by royal command of my Rienzi, which was also a favorite with the court of Saxony. This maneuver was successful, and I soon received a communication from my old friend Kästner to say that the production of Rienzi was fixed for a very early date at the Berlin Court Theatre, and at the same time expressing the hope that I would conduct my work in person. As a very handsome authoress royalty had been paid by this theatre, at the instigation of Kästner, on the occasion of the production of his old Munich friend Lachner's opera, Katharina von Cornaro, I hoped to realize a very substantial improvement in my finances if only the success of Rienzi in this city in any degree rivaled that in Dresden. But my chief desire was to make the acquaintance of the King of Prussia, so that I might read him the text of my Lohengrin and arouse his interest in my work. This, from various signs I flattered myself, was perfectly possible, in which case I intended to beg him to command the first performance of Lohengrin to be given at his court theatre. After my strange experiences as to the way in which my success in Dresden had been kept secret from the rest of Germany, it seemed to me a matter of vital importance to make the future center of my artistic enterprises the only place which exercised any influence on the outside world, and as such I was forced to regard Berlin. Inspired by the success of my recommendation to the Queen of Prussia, I hoped to gain access to the king himself, which I regarded as a most important step. Full of confidence and in excellent spirits, I set out for Berlin in September, trusting to a favorable turn of fortune's wheel, in the first place for the rehearsals of Rienzi, though my interests were no longer centered in this work. Berlin made the same impression on me as on the occasion of my former visit, when I saw it again after my long absence in Paris. Professor Werder, my friend of the Fliegender Holländer, had taken lodgings for me in advance in the renowned Jensdarmerplatz, but when I looked at the view from my windows every day, I could not believe that I was in a city which was the very center of Germany. Soon, however, I was completely absorbed by the cares of the task I had in hand. I had nothing to complain of with regard to the official preparations for Rienzi, but I soon noticed that it was looked upon merely as a conductor's opera, that is to say, all the materials to hand were duly placed at my disposal, but the management had not the slightest intention of doing anything more for me. All the arrangements for my rehearsals were entirely upset as soon as a visit from Jenny Lind was announced, and she occupied the Royal Opera exclusively for some time. During the delay thus caused, I did all I could to attain my main object in introduction to the king, and for this purpose made use of my former acquaintance with the court musical director, Count Riedern. This gentleman received me at once with the greatest affability, invited me to dinner and a soirée, and entered into a hearty discussion with me about the steps necessary for attaining my purpose, in which he promised to do his utmost to help me. I also paid frequent visits to Sanssouci, in order to pay my respects to the Queen and express my thanks to her. But I never got further than an interview with the ladies-in-waiting, and I was advised to put myself into communication with them, Allaire, the head of the Royal Privy Council. This gentleman seemed to be impressed by the seriousness of my request, and promised to do what he could to further my wish for a personal introduction to the king. He asked what my real object was, and I told him it was to get permission from the king to read my libretto Lohengrin to him. On the occasion of one of my oft-repeated visits from Berlin, he asked me whether I did not think it would be advisable to bring a recommendation of my work from Tieck. I was able to tell him that I had already had the pleasure of bringing my case to the notice of the old poet who lived near Potsdam as a royal pensioner. I remembered very well that Frau von Eltischow had sent the themes Lohengrin and Tannhäuser to her old friend some years ago, when these matters were first mentioned between us. When I called upon Tieck, I was welcomed by him almost as a friend, and I found my long talks with him exceedingly valuable. Although Tieck had perhaps gained a somewhat doubtful reputation for the leniency with which he would give his recommendation for the dramatic works of those who applied to him, yet I was pleased by the genuine disgust with which he spoke of our latest dramatic literature, which was modeling itself on the style of modern French stagecraft, and his complaint at the utter lack of any true poetic feeling in it was heartfelt. He declared himself delighted with my poem of Lohengrin, but could not understand how all this was to be set to music without a complete change in the conventional structure of an opera, and on this score he objected to such scenes as that between Ortrud and Frederick at the beginning of the second act. I thought I had roused him to a real enthusiasm when I explained how I proposed to solve these apparent difficulties and also described my own ideals about musical drama. But the higher I soared, the sadder he grew when I had once made known to him my hope of securing the patronage of the King of Prussia for these conceptions and the working out of my scheme for an ideal drama. He had no doubt that the king would listen to me with the greatest interest and even seize upon my ideas with warmth, only I must not entertain the smallest hope of any practical result, unless I wished to expose myself to the bitterest disappointment. What can you expect from a man who today is enthusiastic about Gluck's Iphigenia in Taurus, and tomorrow mad about Donizetti's Lucrezia Borgia? He said. Tieck's conversation about these and similar topics was much too entertaining and charming for me to give any serious weight to the bitterness of his views. He gladly promised to recommend my poem, more particularly to Privy Councillor Allaire, and dismissed me with hearty goodwill and his sincere though anxious blessing. The only result of all my labors was that the desired invitation from the king still hung fire. As the rehearsals for Rienzi, which had been postponed on account of Jenny Lind's visit, were being carried on seriously again, I made up my mind to take no further trouble before the performance of my opera, as I thought myself, at any rate, justified in counting on the presence of the monarch on the first night, as the piece was being played at his express command, and at the same time I hoped this would conduce to the fulfillment of my main object. However, the nearer we came to the event, the lower did the hopes I had built upon it sink. To play the part of the hero, I had to be satisfied with a tenor who was absolutely devoid of talent and far below the average. He was a conscientious, painstaking man, and had moreover been strongly recommended to me by my kind host, the renowned Meinhard. After I had taken infinite pains with him, and had in consequence, as so often happens, conjured up in my mind certain illusions as to what I might expect from his acting, I was obliged, when it came to the final test of the dress rehearsal, to confess my true opinion. I realized that the scenery, chorus, ballet, and minor parts were on the whole excellent, but that the chief character, around whom in this particular opera everything centered, faded into an insignificant phantom. The reception which this opera met with at the hands of the public when it was produced in October was also due to him, but in consequence of the fairly good rendering of a few brilliant passages, and more especially on account of the enthusiastic recognition of Frau Koster in the part of Adriano, it might have been concluded from all the external signs that the opera had been fairly successful. Nevertheless, I knew very well that this seeming triumph could have no real substance, as only the immaterial parts of my work could reach the eyes and ears of the audience. Its essential spirit had not entered their hearts. Moreover, the The Berlin reviewers, in their usual way, began their attacks immediately, with the view of demolishing any success my opera might have won, so that after the second performance, which I also conducted myself, I began to wonder whether my desperate labors were really worthwhile. When I asked the few intimate friends I had their opinion on this point, I elicited much valuable information. Among these friends I must mention, in the first place, Hermann Frank, whom I found again. He had lately settled in Berlin and did much to encourage me. I spent the most enjoyable part of those sad 2 months in his company, of which, however, I had but too little. Our conversation generally turned upon reminiscences of the old days and onto topics which had no connection with the theater, so that I was almost ashamed to trouble him with my complaints on this subject, especially as they concerned my worries about a work which I could not pretend was of any practical importance to the stage. He for his part soon arrived at the conclusion that it had been foolish of me to choose my Rienzi for this occasion, as it was an opera which appealed merely to the general public, in preference to my Tannhäuser, which might have educated a party in Berlin useful to my higher aims. He maintained that the very nature of this work would have aroused a fresh interest in the drama in the minds of people who, like himself, were no longer to be counted among regular theater-goers, precisely because they had given up all hope of ever finding any nobler ideals of the stage. The curious information as to the character of Berlin art in other respects, which Werther gave me from time to time, was most discouraging. With regard to the public, he told me once that at a performance of an unknown work, it was quite useless for me to expect a single member of the audience from the stalls to the gallery to take his seat with any better object in view than to pick as many holes as possible in the production. Although Werther did not wish to discourage me in any of my endeavors, he felt himself obliged to warn me continually not to expect anything above the average from the cultured society of Berlin. He liked to see proper respect paid to the really considerable gifts of the king, and when I asked him how he thought the latter would receive my ideas about the ennobling of opera, he answered, after having listened attentively to a long and fiery tirade on my part, "The king would say to you, 'Go and consult Stonsky.'" This was the opera manager, a fat, smug creature who had grown rusty in following out the most jog-trot routine. In short, everything I learned was calculated to discourage me. I called on Bernhard Marx, who some years ago had shown a kindly interest in my Fliegender Holländer and was courteously received by him. This man, who in his earlier writings and musical criticisms had seemed to me filled with a fire of energy, now struck me as extraordinarily limp and listless when I saw him by the side of his young wife, who was radiantly and bewitchingly beautiful. From his conversation, I soon learned that he also had abandoned even the remotest hope of success for any efforts directed towards the object so dear to both our hearts, on account of the inconceivable shallowness of all the officials connected with the head authority. He told me of the extraordinary fate which had befallen a scheme he had brought to the notice of the king for founding a school of music. In a special audience, the king had gone into the matter with the greatest interest and noticed the minutest detail, so that Marx felt justified in entertaining the strongest possible hopes of success. However, all his labors and negotiations about the business, in the course of which he was driven from pillar to post, proved utterly futile, until at last he was told to have an interview with a certain general. This personage, like the king, had Marx's proposals explained to him in the minutest detail and expressed his warmest sympathy with the undertaking. "And there," said Marx, "at the end of this long rigmarole, the matter ended, and I never heard another word about it." One day I learned that Countess Rossi, the renowned Henriette Sontag, who was living in quiet seclusion in Berlin, had pleasant recollections of me in Dresden, and wished me to visit her. She had at this time already fallen into the unfortunate position which was so detrimental to her artistic career. She too complained bitterly of the general apathy of the influential classes in Berlin, which effectually prevented any artistic aims from being realized. It was her opinion that the king found a sort of satisfaction in knowing that the theater was badly managed, for though he never opposed any criticisms which he received on the subject, he likewise never supported any proposal for its improvement. She expressed a wish to know something of my latest work, and I gave her my poem of Lohengrin for perusal. On the occasion of my next morning call, she told me she would send me an invitation to a musical evening which she was going to have at her house in honor of the Grand Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, her elderly patron, and she also gave me back the manuscript of Lohengrin, with the assurance that it had appealed to her very much, and that while she was reading it, she had often seen the little fairies and elves dancing about in front of her. As in the old days, I had been heartily encouraged by the warm and friendly sympathy of this naturally cultured woman. I now felt as if cold water had been suddenly poured down my back. I soon took my leave and never saw her again. Indeed, I had no particular object in doing so, as the promised invitation never came. Cossack also sought me out, and although our acquaintance did not lead to much, I was sufficiently kindly received by him to give him my poem of Lohengrin to read. I went one day by appointment to see him, and found that his room had just been scrubbed with boiling water. The steam from this operation was so unbearable that it had already given him a headache, and was not less disagreeable to me. He looked into my face with an almost tender expression when he gave me back the manuscript of my poem, and assured me, in accents which admitted of no doubt of his sincerity, that he thought it very pretty. I found my casual intercourse with Troon rather more entertaining. I used to treat him to a good glass of wine at Lutter and Wagener's, where I went occasionally on account of its association with Hoffmann, and he would then listen with apparently growing interest to my ideas as to the possible development of opera and the goal at which we should aim. His comments were generally witty and very much to the point, and his lively and animated ways pleased me very much. After the production of Rienzi, however, he too, as a critic, joined the majority of scoffers and detractors. The only person who supported me stoutly but uselessly, through thick and thin, was my old friend Gallard. His little music shop was not a success, his musical journal had already failed, so that he was only able to help me in small ways. Unfortunately, I discovered not only that he was the author of many exceedingly dubious dramatic works, for which he wished to gain my support, but also that he was apparently in the last stages of the disease from which he was suffering, so that the little intercourse I had with him, in spite of all his fidelity and devotion, only exercised a melancholy and depressing influence upon me. But as I had embarked upon this Berlin enterprise in contradiction to all my inmost wishes, and prompted solely by the desire of winning the success so vital to my position, I made up my mind to make a personal appeal to Rellstab. As in the case of the Fliegender Holländer, he had taken exception more particularly to its nebulousness and lack of form. I thought I might with advantage point out to him the brighter and clearer outline of Rienzi. He seemed to be pleased at my thinking I could get anything out of him, but told me at once of his firm conviction that any new art form was utterly impossible after Gluck, and that the only thing that the best of good luck and hard work was capable of producing was meaningless bombast. I then realized that in Berlin all hope had been abandoned. I was told that Meyerbeer was the only man who had been able in any way to master the situation. This former patron of mine I met once more in Berlin, and he declared that he still took an interest in me. As soon as I arrived, I called on him, but in the hall I found his servant busy packing up trunks, and learned that Meyerbeer was just going away. His master confirmed this assertion, and regretted that he would not be able to do anything for me, so I had to say goodbye and how do you do at the same time. For some time I thought he really was away, but after a few weeks I learned to my surprise that he was still staying in Berlin without letting himself be seen by anyone, and at last he made his appearance again at one of the rehearsals of Rienzi. What this meant I only discovered later from a rumor which was circulated among the initiated, and imparted to me by Edouard von Bülow, my young friend's father. Without having the slightest idea how it originated, I learned, about the middle of my stay in Berlin, from the conductor Taubert, that he had heard on very good authority that I was trying for a director's post at the Court Theatre and had good expectations of securing the appointment in addition to special privileges. In order to remain on good terms with Taubert, as it was very necessary for me to do, I had to give him the most solemn assurances that such an idea had never even entered my head, and that I would not accept such a position if it were offered to me. On the other hand, all my endeavors to get access to the king continued to be fruitless. My chief mediator, to whom I always turned, was still Count Redern, and although my attention had been called to his staunch adherence to Meyerbeer, his extraordinary open and friendly manner always strengthened my belief in his honesty. At last, the only medium that remained open to me was the fact that the king could not possibly stay away from the performance of Rienzi, given at his express command, and on this conviction I based all further hope of approaching him. Whereupon Count Redern informed me, with an expression of deep despair, that on the very day of the first performance the monarch would be away on a hunting party. Once more I begged him to make every effort in his power to secure the king's presence, at least at the second performance, and at length my inexhaustible patron told me that he could not make head or tail of it, but His Majesty seemed to have conceived an utter disinclination to accede to my wish. He himself had heard these hard words fall from the royal lips. "Oh, bother. Have you come to me again with your Rienzi?" At this second performance, I had a pleasant experience. After the impressive second act, the public showed signs of wishing to call me, and as I went from the orchestra to the vestibule, in order to be ready if necessary, my foot slipped on the smooth parquet, and I might have had perhaps a serious fall had I not felt my arm grasped by a strong hand. I turned and recognized the Crown Prince of Prussia, who had come out of his box, and who at once seized the opportunity of inviting me to follow him to his wife, who wished to make my acquaintance. She had only just arrived in Berlin, and told me that she had heard my opera for the first time that evening, and expressed her appreciation of it. She had, however, long ago received very favorable reports of me and my artistic aims from a common friend, Alwine from Man. The whole tenor of this interview, at which the prince was present, was unusually friendly and pleasant. It was indeed my old friend Alwine who in Berlin had not only followed all my fortunes with the greatest sympathy, but had also done all in her power to give me consolation and courage to endure. Almost every evening, when the day's business made it possible, I used to visit her for an hour of recreation and gain strength from her ennobling conversation for the struggle against the reverses of the following day. I was particularly pleased by the warm and intelligent sympathy which she and our mutual friend Werther devoted to Lohengrin, the object of all my labors at that time. On the arrival of her friend and patroness, the Crown Princess, which had been delayed till now, she hoped to hear something more definite as to how my affairs stood with the king, although she intimated to me that even this great lady was in deep disfavor, and could only bring her influence to bear upon the king by observing the strictest etiquette. But from this source also no news reached me till it was time for me to leave Berlin, and I could postpone my departure no longer. As I had to conduct a third performance of Rienzi, and there still remained a remote possibility of receiving a sudden command to Sanssouci, I accordingly fixed on a date which would be the very latest I could wait to ascertain the fate of the projects I had nearest to heart. This period passed by, and I was forced to realize that my hopes of Berlin were wholly shattered. I was in a very depressed state when I made up my mind to this conclusion. I can seldom remember having been so dreadfully affected by the influence of cold and wet weather and an eternally gray sky as during those last wretched weeks in Berlin, when everything that I heard, in addition to my own private anxieties, weighed upon me with a leaden weight of discouragement. My conversations with Hermann Frank about the social and political situation had assumed a peculiarly gloomy tone, as the King of Prussia's efforts to summon a united conference had failed. I was among those who had at first been inclined to see a hopeful significance in this undertaking, but it was a shock to have all the intimate details relating to the project clearly set before me by so well-informed a man as Frank. His dispassionate views on this subject, as well as on the Prussian state in particular, which was supposed to be representative of German intelligence, and was universally considered to be a model of order and good government, so completely disillusioned me and destroyed all the favorable and hopeful opinions I had formed of it, that I felt as if I had plunged into chaos, and realized the utter futility of expecting a prosperous settlement of the German question from this quarter. If in the midst of my misery in Dresden I had founded great hopes from gaining the King of Prussia's sympathy for my ideas, I could no longer close my eyes to the fearful hollowness which the state of affairs disclosed to me on every side. In this despairing mood I felt but little emotion when, on going to say good-bye to Count Redern, he told me with a very sad face the news, which had just arrived, of Mendelssohn's death. I certainly did not realize this stroke of fate, which Redern's obvious grief first brought to my notice. At all events, he was spared more detailed and heartfelt explanation of my own affairs, which he had so much at heart. The only thing that remained for me to do in Berlin was to try and make my material success balance my material loss. For a stay of 2 months, during which my wife and my sister Clara had been with me, lured on by the hope that the production of Rienzi in Berlin would be a brilliant success, I found my old friend, Director Kästner, by no means inclined to compensate me. From his correspondence with me, he could prove up to the hilt that legally he had only expressed the desire for my cooperation in studying Rienzi, but had given me no positive invitation. As I was prevented by Count Redern's grief over Mendelssohn's death from going to him for help in these trivial private concerns, there was no alternative but for me to accept with a good grace Kästner's beneficence in paying me on the spot the royalties on the 3 performances which had already taken place. The Dresden authorities were surprised when I found myself obliged to beg an advance of income from them in order to conclude this brilliant undertaking in Berlin. As I was traveling with my wife in the most horrible weather through the deserted country on my way home, I fell into a mood of the blackest despair, which I thought I might perhaps survive once in a lifetime, but never again. Nevertheless, it amused me as I sat silently looking out of the carriage into the gray mist to hear my wife enter into a lively discussion with a commercial traveler who, in the course of friendly conversation, had spoken in a disparaging way about the new opera Rienzi. My wife, with great heat and even passion, corrected various mistakes made by this hostile critic, and to her great satisfaction made him confess that he had not heard the opera himself, but had only based his opinion upon hearsay and the reviews. Whereupon my wife pointed out to him most earnestly that he could not possibly know whose future he might not injure by such irresponsible comment. These were the only cheering and consoling impressions which I carried back with me to Dresden, where I soon felt the direct results of the reverses I had suffered in Berlin in the condolences of my acquaintances. The papers had spread abroad the news that my opera had been a dismal failure. The most painful part of the whole proceeding was that I had to meet these expressions of pity with a cheerful countenance and the assurance that things were by no means so bad as had been made out, but that, on the contrary, I had had many pleasant experiences. This unaccustomed effort placed me in a position strangely similar to that in which I found Hiller on my return to Dresden. He had given a performance of his new opera, Konradin von Hohenstaufen, here just about this time. He had kept the composition of this work a secret from me, and had hoped to make a decided hit with it after the 3 performances which took place in my absence. Both the poet and the composer thought that in this work they had combined the tendencies and effects of my Rienzi with those of my Tannhäuser in a manner peculiarly suited to the Dresden public. As he was just setting out for Dusseldorf, where he had been appointed concert director, he commended his work with great confidence to my tender mercies, and regretted not having the power of appointing me the conductor of it. He acknowledged that he owed his great success partly to the wonderfully happy rendering of the male part of Conradin by my niece Johanna. She, in her turn, told me with equal confidence that without her Hiller's opera would not have had such an extraordinary triumph. I was now really anxious to see this fortunate work and its wonderful staging for myself, and this I was able to do, as a 4th performance was announced after Hiller and his family had left Dresden for good. When I entered the theater at the beginning of the overture to take my place in the stalls, I was astonished to find all the seats, with a few scarcely noticeable exceptions, absolutely empty. At the other end of my row I saw the poet who had written the libretto, the gentle painter Reinecke. We moved, naturally, towards the middle of the space and discussed the strange position in which we found ourselves. He poured out melancholy complaints to me about Hiller's musical setting to his poetry, the secret of the mistake which Hiller had made about the success of his work he did not explain, and was evidently very much upset at the conspicuous failure of the opera. It was from another quarter that I learned how it had been possible for Hiller to deceive himself in such an extraordinary way. Frau Hiller, who was of Polish origin, had managed at the frequent Polish gatherings which took place in Dresden to persuade a large contingent of her countrymen, who were keen theater-goers, to attend her husband's opera. On the first night these friends, with their usual enthusiasm, incited the public to applaud, but had themselves found so little pleasure in the work that they had stayed away from the second performance, which was otherwise badly attended, so that the opera could only be considered a failure. By commandeering all the help that could possibly be got from the Poles by way of applause, every effort was made to secure a third performance on a Sunday, when the theater generally filled of its own accord. This object was achieved, and the Polish theater aristocracy, with the charity that was habitual to them, fulfilled their duty towards the needy couple in whose drawing room they had often spent such pleasant evenings. Once more the composer was called before the curtain, and everything went off well. Hiller thereupon placed his confidence in the verdict on the third performance, according to which his opera was an undoubted success, just as had been the case with my Tannhäuser. The artificiality of this proceeding was, however, exposed by this fourth performance, at which I was present, and at which no one was under an obligation to the departed composer to attend. Even my niece was disgusted with it, and thought that the best singer in the world could not make a success of such a tedious opera. Whilst we were watching this miserable performance, I managed to point out to the poet some weaknesses and faults that were to be found in the subject matter. The latter reported my criticisms to Hiller, whereupon I received a warm and friendly letter from Dusseldorf, in which Hiller acknowledged the mistake he had made in rejecting my advice on this point. He gave me plainly to understand that it was not too late to alter the opera according to my suggestions. I should thus have had the inestimable benefit of having such an obviously well-intentioned and, in its way, so significant a work in the repertoire, but I never got so far as that. On the other hand, I experienced the small satisfaction of hearing the news that 2 performances of my Rienzi had taken place in Berlin, for the success of which conductor Taubert, as he informed me himself, thought he had won some credit on account of the extremely effective combinations he had arranged. In spite of this, I was absolutely convinced that I must abandon all hope of any lasting and profitable success from Berlin, and I could no longer hide from Eltisho that, if I were to continue in the discharge of my duties with the necessary good spirits, I must insist on a rise of salary, as, beyond my regular income, I could not rely on any substantial success wherewith to meet my unlucky publishing transactions. My income was so small that I could not even live on it, but I asked nothing more than to be placed on an equal footing with my colleague Reisiger, a prospect which had been held out to me from the beginning. At this juncture, Eltisho saw a favorable opportunity for making me feel my dependence on his goodwill, which could only be secured by my showing due deference to his wishes. After I had laid my case before the king, at a personal interview, and asked for the favor of the moderate increase in income which was my object, Eltisho promised to make the report he was obliged to give of me as favorable as possible. How great was my consternation and humiliation when one day he opened our interview by telling me that his report had come back from the king. In it was set forth that I had unfortunately overestimated my talent on account of the foolish praise of various friends in a high position, among whom he counted Frau versus Konneritz, and had thus been led to consider that I had quite as good a right to success as Meyerbeer. I had thereby caused such serious offense that it might, perhaps, be considered advisable to dismiss me altogether. On the other hand, my industry and my praiseworthy performance with regard to the revision of Gluck's Iphigenia, which had been brought to the notice of the management, might justify my being given another chance, in which case my material condition must be given due consideration. At this point I could read no further, and stupefied by surprise I gave my patron back the paper. He tried at once to remove the obviously bad impression it had made upon me by telling me that my wish had been granted, and I could draw the 900 marks belonging to me at once from the bank. I took my leave in silence, and pondered over what course of action I must pursue in face of this disgrace, as it was quite out of the question for me to accept the 900 marks. But in the midst of these adversities a visit of the King of Prussia to Dresden was one day announced, and at the same time by his special request a performance of Tannhäuser was arranged. He really did make his appearance in the theatre at this performance in the company of the royal family of Saxony, and stayed with apparent interest from beginning to end. On this occasion the king gave a curious explanation for having stayed away from the performances of Rienzi in Berlin, which was afterwards reported to me. He said he had denied himself the pleasure of hearing one of my operas in Berlin, because it was important to get a good impression of them, and he knew that in his own theatre they would only be badly produced. This strange event had, at any rate, the result of giving me back sufficient self-confidence to accept the 900 marks of which I was in such desperate need. Eltisho also seemed to make a point of winning back my trust to some extent, and I gathered from his calm friendliness that I must suppose this wholly uncultured man had no consciousness of the outrage he had done me. He returned to the idea of having orchestral concerts, in accordance with the suggestions I had made in my rejected report on the orchestra, and in order to induce me to arrange such musical performances in the theatre, said the initiative had come from the management and not from the orchestra itself. As soon as I discovered that the profits were to go to the orchestra, I willingly entered into the plan. By a special device of my own, the stage of the theatre was made into a concert hall, afterwards considered first class, by means of a sounding board enclosing the whole orchestra, which proved a great success. In future 6 performances were to take place during the winter months. This time, however, as it was the end of the year, and we only had the second half of the winter before us, subscription tickets were issued for only 3 concerts, and the whole available space in the theatre was filled by the public. I found the preparations for this fairly diverting, and entered upon the fateful year 1848 in a rather more reconciled and amiable frame of mind. Early in the new year the first of these orchestral concerts took place, and brought me much popularity on account of its unusual program. I had discovered that if any real significance were to be given to these concerts, in distinction to those consisting of heterogeneous scraps of music of every different species under the sun, and which are so opposed to all serious artistic taste, we could only afford to give 2 kinds of genuine music alternately if a good effect was to be produced. Accordingly, between 2 symphonies I placed 1 or 2 longer vocal pieces, which were not to be heard elsewhere, and these were the only items in the whole concert. After the Mozart Symphony in D major, I made all the musicians move from their places to make room for an imposing choir, which had to sing Palestrinae Stabat Mater from an adaptation of the original recitative, which I had carefully revised, and Bach's motet for 8 voices, Singet dem Herrn ein neues Lied, sing unto the Lord a new song. Thereupon I let the orchestra again take its place to play Beethoven's Sinfonia Eroica, and with that to end the concert. This success was very encouraging and disclosed to me a somewhat consoling prospect of increasing my influence as musical conductor at a time when my disgust was daily growing stronger at the constant meddling with our opera repertoire, which made me lose more and more influence as compared with the wishes of my would-be prima donna niece, whom even Tischetschek supported. Immediately on my return from Berlin, I had begun the orchestration of Lohengrin, and in all other respects had given myself up to greater resignation, which made me feel I could face my fate calmly, when I suddenly received a very disturbing piece of news. In the beginning of February, my mother's death was announced to me. I once hastened to her funeral at Leipzig and was filled with deep emotion and joy at the wonderfully calm and sweet expression of her face. She had passed the latter years of her life, which had before been so active and restless, in cheerful ease, and at the end in peaceful and almost childlike happiness. On her deathbed, she exclaimed in humble modesty and with a bright smile on her face, "Oh, how beautiful! How lovely! How divine! Why do I deserve such favor?" It was a bitterly cold morning when we lowered the coffin into the grave in the churchyard, and the hard, frozen lumps of earth which we scattered on the lid, instead of the customary handful of dust, frightened me by the loud noise they made. On the way home to the house of my brother-in-law, Hermann Brockhaus, where the whole family were to gather together for an hour, Lobby, of whom my mother had been very fond, was my only companion. He expressed his anxiety at my unusually exhausted appearance, and when he afterwards accompanied me to the station, we discussed the unbearable burden which seemed to us to lie like a dead weight on every noble effort made to resist the tendency of the time to sink into utter worthlessness. On my return to Dresden, the realization of my complete loneliness came over me for the first time with full consciousness, as I could not help knowing that with the loss of my mother, every natural bond of union was loosened with my brothers and sisters, each of whom was taken up with his or her own family affairs. So I plunged dully and coldly into the only thing which could cheer and warm me, the working out of my Lohengrin and my studies of German antiquity. Thus dawned the last days of February, which were to plunge Europe once more into revolution. I was among those who least expected a probable or even possible overthrow of the political world. My first knowledge of such things had been gained in my youth at the time of the July Revolution and the long and peaceful reaction that followed it. Since then I had become acquainted with Paris, and from all the signs of public life which I saw there, I thought all that had occurred had been merely the preliminaries of a great revolutionary movement. I had been present at the erection of the forts détachés around Paris, which Louis Philippe had carried out, and been instructed about the strategic value of the various fixed sentries scattered about Paris, and I agreed with those who considered that everything was ready to make even an attempt at a rising on the part of the populace of Paris quite impossible. When, therefore, the Swiss War of Separation at the end of the previous year and the successful Sicilian Revolution at the beginning of the new year turned all men's eyes in great excitement to watch the effect of these risings on Paris, I did not take the slightest interest in the hopes and fears which were aroused. News of the growing restlessness in the French capital did indeed reach us, but I disputed Archelaus' belief that any significance could be attached to it. I was sitting in the conductor's desk at a rehearsal of Martha when, during an interval, Archel, with the peculiar joy of being in the right, brought me the news of Louis Philippe's flight and the proclamation of the Republic in Paris. This made a strange and almost astonishing impression on me, although at the same time the doubt as to the true significance of these events made it possible for me to smile to myself. I, too, caught the fever of excitement which had spread everywhere. The German March days were coming, and from all directions ever more alarming news kept coming in. Even within the narrow confines of my native Saxony, serious petitions were framed, which the king withstood for a long time. Even he was deceived, in a way which he was soon to acknowledge, as to the meaning of this commotion and the temper that prevailed in the country. On the evening of one of these really anxious days, when the very air was heavy and full of thunder, we gave our third great orchestral concert, at which the king and his court were present, as on the two previous occasions. For the opening of this one I had chosen Mendelssohn's Symphony in A minor, which I had played on the occasion of his funeral. The mood of this piece, which even in the would-be joyful phrases is always tenderly melancholy, corresponded strangely with the anxiety and depression of the whole audience, which was more particularly accentuated in the demeanor of the royal family. I did not conceal from Lipinski, the leader of the orchestra, my regret at the mistake I had made in the arrangement of that day's program, as Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, also in a minor key, was to follow this minor symphony. With a merry twinkle in his eyes, the eccentric Pole comforted me by exclaiming, "Oh, let us play only the first two movements of the symphony in C minor, then no one will know whether we have played Mendelssohn in the major or the minor key." Fortunately, before these two movements began, to our great surprise, a loud shout was raised by some patriotic spirit in the middle of the audience, who called out, "Long live the King!" And the cry was promptly repeated with unusual enthusiasm and energy. On all sides. Lipinski was perfectly right. The symphony, with the passionate and stormy excitement of the first theme, swelled out like a hurricane of rejoicing, and had seldom produced such an effect on the audience as on that night. This was the last of the newly inaugurated concerts that I ever conducted in Dresden. Shortly after this, the inevitable political changes took place. The king dismissed his ministry and elected a new one, consisting partly of liberals and partly even of really enthusiastic Democrats, who at once proclaimed the well-known regulations, which are the same all over the world, for founding a thoroughly democratic constitution. I was really touched by this result, and by the heartfelt joy which was evident among the whole population, and I would have given much to have been able to gain access to the king, and convince myself of his hearty confidence in the people's love for him, which seemed to me so desirable a consummation. In the evening the town was gaily illuminated, and the king drove through the streets in an open carriage. In the greatest excitement, I went out among the dense crowds and followed his movements, often running where I thought it likely that a particularly hearty shout might rejoice and reconcile the monarch's heart. My wife was quite frightened when she saw me come back late at night, tired out and very hoarse from shouting. The events which took place in Vienna and Berlin, with their apparently momentous results, only moved me as interesting newspaper reports, and the meeting of a Frankfurt parliament in the place of the dissolved Bundestag sounded strangely pleasant in my ears. Yet all these significant occurrences could not tear me for a single day from my regular hours of work. With immense, almost overweening satisfaction, I finished, in the last days of this eventful and historic month of March, the score of Lohengrin with the orchestration of the music up to the vanishing of the night of the Holy Grail into the remote and mystic distance. About this time a young Englishwoman, Madame Jessie Lawsett, who had married a Frenchman in Bordeaux, one day presented herself at my house in the company of Karl Ritter, who was barely 18 years of age. This young man, who was born in Russia of German parents, was a member of one of those northern families who had settled down permanently in Dresden on account of the pleasant artistic atmosphere of that place. I remembered that I had seen him once before, not long after the first performance of Tannhäuser, when he asked me for my autograph for a copy of the score of that opera, which was on sale at the music shop. I now learned that this copy really belonged to Frau Lawsett, who had been present at those performances and who was now introduced to me. Overcome with shyness, the young lady expressed her admiration in a way I had never experienced before, and at the same time told me how great was her regret at being called away by family affairs from her favorite home in Dresden with the Ritter family, who, she gave me to understand, were deeply devoted to me. It was with a strange, and in its way quite a new, sensation that I bade farewell to this young lady. This was the first time since my meeting with Alwine from Man and Werter, when the Fliegender Holländer was produced, that I came across this sympathetic tone, which seemed to come like an echo from some old familiar past, but which I never heard close at hand. I invited young Ritter to come and see me whenever he liked, and to accompany me sometimes on my walks. His extraordinary shyness, however, seemed to prevent him from doing this, and I only remember seeing him very occasionally at my house. He used to turn up more often with Hans von Bülow, whom he seemed to know pretty well, and who had already entered the Leipzig University as a student of law. This well-informed and talkative young man showed his warm and hearty devotion to me more openly, and I felt bound to reciprocate his affection. He was the first person who made me realize the genuine character of the new political enthusiasm. On his hat, as well as on his father's, the black, red, and gold cockade was paraded before my eyes. Now that I had finished my Lohengrin and had leisure to study the course of events, I could no longer help myself sympathizing with the ferment aroused by the birth of German ideals and the hopes attached to their realization. My old friend Frank had already imbued me with a fairly sound political judgment, and, like many others, I had grave doubts as to whether the German parliament now assembling would serve any useful purpose. Nevertheless, the temper of the populace, of which there could be no question, although it might not have been given very obvious expression, and the belief, everywhere prevalent, that it was impossible to return to the old conditions, could not fail to exercise its influence upon me. But I wanted actions instead of words, and actions which would force our princes to break forever with their old traditions, which were so detrimental to the cause of the German Commonwealth. With this object, I felt inspired to write a popular appeal in verse, calling upon the German princes and peoples to inaugurate a great crusade against Russia, as the country which had been the prime instigator of that policy in Germany, which had so fatally separated the monarchs from their subjects. One of the verses ran as follows: "The old fight against the East returns again today. The people's sword must not rust. Who freedom wish for I." As I had no connection with political journals, and had learned by chance that Berthold Auerbach was on the staff of a paper in Mannheim, where the waves of revolution ran high, I sent him my poem with the request to do whatever he thought best with it, and from that day to this I have never heard or seen anything of it. Whilst the Frankfurt Parliament continued to sit on from day to day, and it seemed idle to conjecture whither this big talk by small men would lead, I was much impressed by the news which reached us from Vienna. In the May of this year, an attempt at a reaction, such as had succeeded in Naples and remained indecisive in Paris, had been triumphantly nipped in the bud by the enthusiasm and energy of the Viennese people under the leadership of the students' band, who had acted with such unexpected firmness. I had arrived at the conclusion that, in matters directly concerning the people, no reliance could be placed on reason or wisdom, but only on sheer force supported by fanaticism or absolute necessity. But the course of events in Vienna, where I saw the youth of the educated classes working side by side with the laboring man, filled me with peculiar enthusiasm, to which I gave expression in another popular appeal in verse. This I sent to the Österreichischen Zeitung, where it was printed in their columns with my full signature. In Dresden, 2 political unions had been formed as a result of the great changes that had taken place. The first was called the Deutscher Verein, German Union, whose program aimed at a constitutional monarchy on the broadest democratic foundation. The names of its principal leaders, among which, in spite of its broad democratic foundation, my friends Edouard de Vriend and Professor Richel had the courage openly to appear, guaranteed the safety of its objects. This union, which tried to include every element that regarded a real revolution with abhorrence, conjured into existence an opposition club which called itself the Vaterlandsverein, Patriotic Union. In this, the democratic foundation seemed to be the chief basis, and the constitutional monarchy only provided the necessary cloak. Arkel canvassed passionately for the latter, as he seemed to have lost all confidence in the monarchy. The poor fellow was, indeed, in a very bad way. He had long ago given up all hope of rising to any position in the musical world. His directorship had become pure drudgery and was, unfortunately, so badly paid that he could not possibly keep himself and his yearly increasing family on the income he derived from his post. He always had an unconquerable aversion from teaching, which was a fairly profitable employment in Dresden among the many wealthy visitors. So he went on from bad to worse, running miserably into debt, and for a long time saw no hope for his position as the father of a family except in emigration to America, where he thought he could secure a livelihood for himself and his dependents by manual labor, and for his practical mind by working as a farmer, from which class he had originally sprung. This, though tedious, would at least be certain. On our walks he had of late been entertaining me almost exclusively with ideas he had gleaned from reading books on farming, doctrines which he applied with zeal to the improvement of his encumbered position. This was the mood in which the Revolution of 1848 found him, and he immediately went over to the extreme socialist side, which, owing to the example set by Paris, threatened to become serious. Everyone who knew him was utterly taken aback at the apparently vital change which had so suddenly taken place in him, when he declared that he had at last found his real vocation, that of an agitator. His persuasive faculties, on which, however, he could not rely sufficiently for platform purposes, developed in private intercourse into stupefying energy. It was impossible to stop his flow of language with any objection, and those he could not draw over to his cause he cast aside forever. In his enthusiasm about the problems which occupied his mind day and night, he sharpened his intellect into a weapon capable of demolishing every foolish objection, and suddenly stood in our midst like a preacher in the wilderness. He was at home in every department of knowledge. The Vaterlandsverein had elected a committee for carrying into execution a plan for arming the populace. This included Arkell and other thoroughgoing Democrats, and, in addition, certain military experts, among whom was my old friend Hermann Müller, the lieutenant of the guards who had once been engaged to Schroeder de Vriend. He and another officer named Ziklinski were the only members of the Saxon army who joined the political movement. The part one played in the meetings of this committee, as in everything else, was dictated by artistic motives. As far as I can remember, the details of this plan, which at last became a nuisance, afforded very sound foundation for a genuine arming of the people, though it was impossible to carry it out during the political crisis. My interest and enthusiasm about the social and political problems which were occupying the whole world increased every day, until public meetings and private intercourse, and the shallow platitudes which formed the staple eloquence of the orators of the day, proved to me the terrible shallowness of the whole movement. If only I could rest assured that, while such senseless confusion was the order of the day, people well versed in these matters would withhold from any demonstration, which to my great regret I observed in Hermann Frank, and told him of openly. Then, on the contrary, I should feel myself compelled, as soon as the opportunity arose, to discuss the purport of such questions and problems according to my judgment. Needless to say, The newspapers played an exciting and prominent part on this occasion. Once, when I went incidentally, as I might go to see a play, to a meeting of the Vaterlandsverein, when they were assembled in a public garden, they chose for the subject of their discussion, republic or monarchy. I was astonished to hear and to read with what incredible triviality it was carried on, and how the sum total of their explanation was that, to be sure, a republic is best, but, at the worst, one could put up with a monarchy if it were well conducted. As the result of many heated discussions on this point, I was incited to lay bare my views on the subject in an article which I published in the Dresdener Anzeiger, but which I did not sign. My special aim was to turn the attention of the few who really took the matter seriously, from the external form of the government to its intrinsic value. When I had pursued and consistently discussed the utmost idealistic conclusions of all that which, to my mind, was necessary and inseparable from the perfect state and from social order, I inquired whether it would not be possible to realize all this with a king at the head, and entered so deeply into the matter as to portray the king in such a fashion that he seemed even more anxious than anyone else that his state should be organized on genuinely republican lines, in order that he might attain to the fulfillment of his own highest aims. I must own, however, that I felt bound to urge this king to assume a much more familiar attitude towards his people than the court atmosphere and the almost exclusive society of his nobles would seem to render possible. Finally, I pointed to the King of Saxony as being specially chosen by fate to lead the way in the direction I had indicated, and to give the example to all the other German princes. Arkell considered this article a true inspiration from the angel of propitiation, but as he feared that it would not meet with proper recognition and appreciation in the paper, he urged me to lecture on it publicly at the next meeting of the Vaterlandsverein, for he attached great importance to my discoursing on the subject personally. Quite uncertain as to whether I could really persuade myself to do this, I attended the meeting, and there, owing to the intolerable balderdash uttered by a certain barrister named Blode and a master furrier Klett, whom at that time Dresden venerated as a Demosthenes and a Cleon, I passionately decided to appear at this extraordinary tribunal with my paper, and to give a very spirited reading of it to about 3,000 persons. The success I had was simply appalling. The astounded audience seemed to remember nothing of the speech of the orchestral conductor Royal save the incidental attack I had made upon the court sycophants. The news of this incredible event spread like wildfire. The next day I rehearsed Rienzi, which was to be performed the following evening. I was congratulated on all sides upon my self-sacrificing audacity. On the day of the performance, however, I was informed by Isolde, the attendant of the orchestra, that the plans had been changed, and he gave me to understand that thereby there hung a tale. True enough, the terrible sensation I had made became so great that the directors feared the most unheard-of demonstrations at any performance of Rienzi. Then a perfect storm of derision and vituperation broke loose in the press, and I was besieged on all sides to such an extent that it was useless to think of self-defense. I had even offended the communal guard of Saxony, and was challenged by the commander to make a full apology. But the most inexorable enemies I made were the court officials, especially those holding a minor office, and to this day I still continue to be persecuted by them. I learned that, as far as it lay in their power, they incessantly besought the king, and finally the director, to deprive me at once of my office. On account of this, I thought it necessary to write to the monarch personally, in order to explain to him that my action was to be regarded more in the light of a thoughtless indiscretion than as a culpable offense. I sent this letter to Havan Eltisho, begging him to deliver it to the king and to arrange at the same time a short leave for me, so that the provoking disturbance should have a chance of dying down during my absence from Dresden. The striking kindness and goodwill which Havan Eltisho showed me on this occasion made no little impression upon me, and this I took no pains to conceal from him. As in the course of time, however, his ill-controlled rage at various things, and especially at a good deal that he had misunderstood in my pamphlet, broke loose. I learned that it was not from any humane motives that he had spoken in such a propitiatory manner to me, but rather by desire of the king himself. On this point I received most accurate information, and heard that when everybody, and even von Eltisho himself, were besieging the king to visit me with punishment, the king had forbidden any further talk on the subject. After this very encouraging experience, I flattered myself that the king had understood not only my letter, but also my pamphlet, better than many others. In order to change my mind a little, I determined for the present, it was the beginning of July, to take advantage of the short period of leave granted to me by going to Vienna. I traveled by way of Breslau, where I looked up an old friend of my family, the musical director Moswius, at whose house I spent an evening. We had a most lively conversation, but unfortunately were unable to steer clear of the stirring political questions of the day. What interested me most was his exceptionally large, or even, if I remember rightly, complete collection of Sebastian Bach's cantatas in most excellent copies. Besides this, he related, with a humor quite his own, several amusing musical anecdotes which were a pleasant memory for many a year. When Moswius returned my visit in the course of the summer at Dresden, I played a part of the first act of Lohengrin on the piano for him, and the expression of his genuine astonishment at this conception was very gratifying to me. In later years, however, I found that he had spoken somewhat scoffingly about me, but I did not stop to reflect as to the truth of this information, or as to the real character of the man, for little by little I had to accustom myself to the most inconceivable things. At Vienna, the first thing I did was to call on Professor Fischhoff, as I knew that he had in his keeping important manuscripts, chiefly by Beethoven, among which the original of the C minor sonata, Opus 111, I was particularly curious to see. Through this new friend, whom I found somewhat dry, I made the acquaintance of Hervesk von Puttlingen, who, as the composer of a most insignificant opera, Joan of Arc, which had been performed in Dresden, had with cautious good taste adopted only the last two syllables of Beethoven's Namehaven. One day we were at his house to dinner, and I then recognized in him a former confidential official of Prince Metternich, who now, with his ribbon of black, red, and gold, followed the current of the age, apparently quite convinced. I made another interesting acquaintance in the person of Herr von Fonten, the Russian state counselor and attaché at the Russian embassy in Vienna. I frequently met this man, both at Fischhof's house and on excursions into the surrounding country, and it was interesting to me for the first time to run up against a man who could so strongly profess his faith in the pessimistic standpoint that a consistent despotism guarantees the only order of things which can be tolerated. Not without interest, and certainly not without intelligence, for he boasted of having been educated at the most enlightened schools in Switzerland. He listened to my enthusiastic narration of the art ideal which I had in my mind, and which was destined to exercise a great and decided influence upon the human race. As he had to allow that the realization of this ideal could not be effected through the strength of despotism, and as he was unable to foresee any rewards for my exertions, by the time we came to the champagne, he thawed to such a degree of affable good nature as to wish me every success. I learned later on that this man, of whose talent and energetic character I had at the time no small opinion, was last heard of as being in great distress. Now, as I never undertook anything whatever without some serious object in view, I had made up my mind to avail myself of this visit to Vienna in order to try in some practical manner to promote my ideas for the reform of the theater. Vienna seemed to me specially suitable for this purpose, as at that time it had 5 theaters, all totally different in character, which were dragging on a miserable existence. I quickly worked out a plan, according to which these various theaters might be formed into a sort of cooperative organization, and placed under one administration composed not only of active members, but also of all those having any literary connection with the theater. With a view to submitting my plan to them, I then made inquiries about persons with such capacities as seemed most likely to answer my requirements. Besides Herr Friedrich Uhl, whom I had got to know at the very beginning through Fischer, and who did me very good service, I was told of a Herr Frank, the same, I presume, who later on published a big epic work called Tannhäuser, and a Dr. Pacher, an agent of Meyerbeer's, and a pettifogger of whose acquaintance later on I was to have no reason to be proud. The most sympathetic, and certainly the most important, of those chosen by me for the conference meeting at Fischhof's house was undoubtedly Dr. Becher, a passionate and exceedingly cultivated man. He was the only one present who seriously followed the reading of my plan, although, of course, he by no means agreed with everything. I observed in him a certain wildness and vehemence, the impression of which returned to me very vividly some months later, when I heard of his being shot as a rebel who had participated in the October insurrection at Vienna. For the present, then, I had to satisfy myself with having read the plan of my theater reform to a few attentive listeners. All seemed to be convinced that the time was not opportune for putting forward such peaceable schemes of reform. On the other hand, Uhl thought it right to give me an idea of what was at present all the rage in Vienna by taking me one evening to a political club of the most advanced tendencies. There I heard a speech by a Sigismund Englander, who shortly afterwards attracted much attention in the political monthly papers. The unblushing audacity with which he and others expressed themselves that evening with regard to the most dreaded persons in public power astounded me almost as much as the poverty of the political views expressed on that occasion. By way of contrast, I received a very nice impression of Grillparzer, the poet, whose name was like a fable to me, associated as it was, from my earliest days, with his Frau. I approached him also with respect to the matter of my theatre reform. He seemed quite disposed to listen in a friendly manner to what I had to say to him. He did not, however, attempt to conceal his surprise at my direct appeals and the personal demands I made of him. He was the first playwright I had ever seen in an official uniform. After I had paid an unsuccessful visit to Bornfeld, relative to the same business, I concluded that Vienna was of no more use for the present, and gave myself up to the exceptionally stimulating impressions produced by the public life of the motley crowd, which of late had undergone such marked changes. If the student band, which was always represented in great numbers in the streets, had already amused me with the extraordinary constancy with which its members sported the German colors, I was very highly diverted by the effect produced when at the theaters I saw even the ices served by attendants in the black, red, and gold of Austria. At the Karl Theatre, in the Leopold quarter of the town, I saw a new farce by Nestroy, which actually introduced the character of Prince Metternich, and in which the statesman, on being asked whether he had poisoned the Duke of Reichstadt, had to make his escape behind the wings as an unmasked sinner. On the whole, the appearance of this imperial city, usually so fond of pleasure, impressed one with a feeling of youthful and powerful confidence. And this impression was revived in me when I heard of the energetic participation of the youthful members of the population during those fateful October days in the defense of Vienna against the troops of Prince Windisgratz.